Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another one of our conversations here with Dan.
How's it going?
It's going well, going well. Today's question actually comes from an old series you did called Passage Attack.
Yeah.
And if you haven't checked those out and you want to do it, they're still in the archives. We've got a playlist for it, but where you kind of dug into some key scriptures and a different passage is just why that's why they were called Passage Attack.
Yeah.
It seems self-explanatory. I don't know why I'm taking time. But she said that she had studied through this passage in Galatians, and there was one verse that she wanted you to dig into a little more if you could.
Okay.
And that's in Galatians chapter 3, or verse 20.
Okay.
And I'm over here in Ephesians.
Well, that's not going to work for us.
That's not going to help me much. So I'm going to turn back here to Galatians chapter 3.
Read 3:20 there for us.
All right. Galatians chapter 3, verse 20 says, "Now an intermediary implies more than one, but God is one."
Okay. Now that verse by itself just seems weird, doesn't it?
It's very strange.
Yeah.
Without knowing the context of the discussion.
Now we're talking.
Ah, okay.
So in the entire third chapter, especially when you start down here about verse 7 or 8, he's talking about Abraham and the promise to Abraham and how the gospel of Christ arises out of that promise to Abraham.
Okay. Good news of salvation sort of gospel.
Well, it's the good news that Abraham, in your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed.
Okay.
Then in Galatians 3:16, he says what?
3:16 says, "Now the promises were made to Abraham and to his offspring." It does not say to his offsprings, referring to many, but referring to one. "And to your offspring, who is Christ."
All right, so I would translate seed. You said offspring, same. In your offspring, in your seed, all the families of the earth shall be blessed.
Okay.
So he's saying that offspring refers to Christ. So he's talking about, in Galatians 3, in the wider context, two covenants. One is God's covenant with Abraham.
Yep.
The other is God's covenant with the Israelites at Mount Sinai.
Okay.
The Abrahamic covenant is a one-way covenant. It is what's called a unilateral covenant.
Coming from God to the people.
Well, it's that it has no conditions and it does not rest on the behavior of the other party.
Okay.
So God said, "I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great. I will bless those that bless you and curse those that curse you, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." There's not an if you do something in there.
Right.
It is unilateral. It does not depend on us. It depends only on God.
Okay.
Okay? Then he begins to talk in verse 17 about the fact that if we add something to that Abraham covenant,
Yeah.
it doesn't take away from that because God said, "I will." And God always does what God will. So pick it up at verse 17.
"This is what I mean. The law, which came 430 years afterward."
After what, Jed?
After the Abrahamic covenant.
Now we're cooking with some hot grease.
All right. So 430 years after Abraham, that does not annul a covenant previously ratified by God.
In other words, it does not annul which covenant?
The Abrahamic covenant.
Now we're cooking.
The unilateral covenant.
That's
here.
right. So the law came after it. Doesn't change what God said God would do. Keep going.
Yeah. That would make so as to make the promise void. For if the inheritance comes by the law, it no longer comes by promise. But God gave it to Abraham by a promise.
So the Abrahamic covenant is the everlasting covenant of God said, "I will, I will, I will, I will."
Yep.
The Mosaic covenant between God and Israel does not change one thing about the Abrahamic covenant.
Okay.
All right, now read verse 19.
So why the law? Which is the natural question that someone would ask with all this. Why the law? It was added because of transgressions.
It was added. It was added to what?
To the Abrahamic covenant.
Now we're cooking.
Okay? Because of the transgressions until the offspring should come to whom the promise had been made.
All right, and if it was added to the Abrahamic promise because of transgressions until the offspring should come. Go back to verse 16. Who's the offspring?
And the offspring is, all right, this is the promise made to Abraham to his offspring. It does not say the offspring's referring to one, and to your offspring, who is Christ.
So the Mosaic Covenant was added to the Abrahamic Covenant until the offspring,
Who is Christ,
should come.
Okay.
See? So it was a temporary covenant, the Mosaic Covenant was. The Abrahamic Covenant is an eternal covenant, not temporary.
Yeah.
Okay. So read then verse 19 and 20 together.
All right, so 19. So why then the law? It was added because of transgressions until the offspring should come to whom the promise had been made. And it was put in place through angels by an intermediary. Now, an intermediary implies more than one, but God is one.
All right. The Mosaic Covenant had an intermediary. Moses was the intermediary, and the angels helped in that with Moses. But the reason there needed to be an intermediary is because now there's two active parties in the covenant. God is active, Israel is active. And so you have to present the deal, and the people over here have to accept the deal. And this time in Exodus 19:5, God says, now therefore, if you all will obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you will be my own possession. So it was an if-then covenant, unlike the Abrahamic covenant.
Yeah.
So since the Abrahamic covenant only depended on one party, there was no need for a mediator because God alone, God is one, verse 20. He's the only one that was involved in the stipulation of that covenant. But in the Mosaic covenant, there had to be a mediator because it's a bilateral covenant between two parties, God and Israel.
Okay.
So a mediator is not of one. So he's talking about the Mosaic covenant.
Yeah.
But God is one. That's the Abrahamic covenant.
So this intermediary that's being mentioned here, is this talking, it's trying to talk against or whatever, another spiritual intermediary, or is it talking about the priests and the prophets and all these other things? No,
it's talking about Moses, because if you go back to Exodus chapter 24, let's go back to Exodus 24.
Right. Okay. Exodus 24.
See, Moses comes down from the mountain with the deal, with the covenant stipulations.
Right.
Verse 7 says...
Verse 7 says, then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient.
All right, so Moses gets the commands from God. He reads the stipulations of the deal, the commands to the Israelites. The Israelites say, okay, we agree. We'll do whatever the Lord has just commanded us to do. So there's an intermediary between God and Israel sealing the deal. And then Moses in the next verse does what?
Verse 8, Moses took the blood, threw it on the people, and said, behold, the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all of these words.
All right, so when God offered the deal, Moses said, here's God's offer. The people accepted the offer, and then they spattered the blood to sign the papers.
Okay. So going back to this intermediary, it's just talking about that was Moses, not some extra God that suddenly came into the equation.
Yeah, but the point of the whole thing is it's a comparison between the Abrahamic covenant and the Mosaic covenant.
Yeah.
The Abrahamic covenant depends only on God, so we don't need a mediator.
Right.
The Mosaic covenant depends on the people as well as God.
Okay.
So it says, but a mediator is not of one. That is...
Okay.
That's the Mosaic covenant. You had to have two parties. You had to have Moses in the middle, but God is one. That's your Abrahamic covenant where God just says, I will. Boom.
So when you pull this out of context, it keeps sounding like the intermediary is a person or persons or spiritual persons, but what it's trying to talk about is those two covenants. So
the intermediary is Moses in this case.
Right. But then when it says more than one and God is one,
that's the
it's
two
talking
parties.
about the covenants, not going back to Moses as the intermediary.
Well, okay. So a mediator is not of one, meaning if it was just one person involved, you wouldn't need a mediator.
Right.
But God is one. He's the only one that said, I will, I will, I will, I will in the Abrahamic covenant. This is, verse 20 is simply a contrast between the different types of covenants, because one takes a mediator and two parties to behave right and agree. The other just takes God.
Okay.
That's the whole point.
So maybe if we were to plug in, instead of it saying one in this verse, just to kind of really crystallize it. Now, an intermediary, Moses, implies more than one. What would we put there?
More than one party in the covenant.
So an intermediary implies more than one person involved in this covenant, but God is one who fulfills a covenant.
Right. So that's exactly what it means. It's that when God just said, I will, there's no other person's behavior or responsibility or acceptance involved.
Okay.
But in the case of Israel and Moses, there was a deal offered, a deal accepted, and it depended on the behavior of both God and Israel.
Okay. Well, I hope that helps clarify some of that verse. There's a lot going on in such a short little verse there.
Yeah.
But it hinges on so much that was being discussed before.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right.
So he continues there in verse 21, is the law therefore against the promises of God? In other words, does the law of Moses contradict in any way the Abrahamic covenant?
Yeah.
No, and not at all, but it doesn't change anything. Mm-hmm. And his point in the whole book of Galatians is the seed that was to come was Christ, any way you slice it.
Yeah.
And the Mosaic law didn't change anything about that all nations would eventually be blessed through Christ.
There we go.
There it is.
Yeah. So I hope that helps bring a little more clarity to that verse 20. If you're interested in looking through the rest of that study, I forget the exact section that was done. It may have been 15 through 23, done a little more detail, the whole thing. But by all means, check out that. Search for the passage attack on that. Yeah. But Dan, thank you for this.
Yeah, verses can be weird by themselves. Yeah. But when they fit in a discussion, it usually pans out.
Yeah. And even in that one, it takes a little of understanding of those, what was one being referred to.
And so, if I was to smooth this out for modern readers and add a word of explanation or two, a mediator is not necessary if there's just one party, but only God is the party involved in the Abrahamic covenant. See, that's kind of what the verse actually means.
Okay. So again, hope it's been useful, helpful to you today in your studies, and we look forward to what we're getting into next time. I think we're going to do another kind of verse study, look at a word out of Romans, I believe, possibly.
I think that was imputed to us. Let's save that for next time.
I couldn't tell if you were thinking of a setup or thinking about what we were doing next. It was all a setup. It always is. See y'all next time.